Bitch by Jason Bradford. Chapter 21. A Day in the Life of a Salem Witch. September 1692. Salem, Massachusetts. Elizabeth stood before a dead bear cub. The forest was silent, other than the normal sounds of insects and animals in the distance. She looked around and noticed that none of the sounds were coming from directly near her. It was as if she were placed within a protective barrier, and nothing lived around her, just her and the dead bear cub. A voice from the shadows spoke to her. It was the voice of a man she could not see, but she was familiar with the voice, and she knew who it came from. She was not scared. "Are you ready?" the voice from the hidden man asked. "To try again?" "Yes." Elizabeth nodded slightly, never taking her eyes off the dead animal before her. Maggots infested the bloated belly of the baby animal. The smell was strong, death and decay. Elizabeth smiled. "Do you give your soul to me?" the man asked. "Yes." She stood as still as before, staring down at the black, fuzzy, bloated corpse. Nothing happened, no sound, no movement. "God damn it," the voice shouted. "You lied to me still!" "No," she exclaimed in fear. "I swear to ye, I give myself freely." "Until you do truly," venom in his voice. "Thy bear shall lie still and rot." Elizabeth's eyes swelled with tears. Her body trembled. The silence of the woods swirled about her, and she found comfort in it. She lifted her thin white undergarment that she wore with no other articles of clothing and inserted a finger into herself. Her hips began to gyrate as she licked her lips and gazed off into the woods, imagining the man was watching her. She brought herself to climax, and her body shivered. "I give myself to ye," Elizabeth promised, "in all ways and deeds. My soul is yours, now and always." With her fingers still in her warm and moist core, and final waves of pleasure pulsating from it, Elizabeth stared down at the dead cub. It twitched slowly, and its milky eyes opened slightly. Its legs moved, and the debris beneath it shifted in its disturbance. Within a moment or two, the bloated and decaying bear cub was standing and looking up at Elizabeth. "And now," the man said with a tinge of satisfaction, "thou art mine." Elizabeth smiled, but it was stolen from her with the placement of a hand on her shoulder. The unexpected connection startled her. Someone had slipped through her protective barrier. She looked up to see Reverend Task, staring into her eyes and into her lost soul. Elizabeth stomped hard upon the poor neck of the cub, sending it back to death for good. Several days later, Elizabeth stood before the council and the judge. Her thin white underclothing was torn and stained from being locked within a dirty cell. "Elizabeth Good," the judge shouted from behind his bench, which was sat in the old courthouse in Salem, Massachusetts. "What says ye?" "I am innocent of witchcraft," she answered. "And I know not the devil," she lied. "The church doth give you one last chance to commit ye are witched," the judge insisted. "Be washed of sin, or thou will hang and swing a corrupt sinner with thine coven." Elizabeth was silent. She looked at the men and the women in the small building lined with wooden seats that were filled with the villagers from her small community. "Then so it be that I burn, for I know not of your God." She looked around for one person who may speak out in her favor. The men were stern-faced with white wigs and powder to match. The women were donned in their dowdy brown and gray dresses and headdresses. No one offered the glance she was hoping for. No one believed her to be anything less, nor anything more, than a witch. She had been in this small, God-fearing village for all of her 29 years of life. She grew up with many faces who looked back at her now with contempt and scorn and blame. Elizabeth felt heat in her cheeks as anger rose. The betrayal she received burned hot, and hatred festered in her soul for the very condemners that surrounded her. "I give you word," she hissed, "that I will be back in the night, and I will steal away your children and their fathers to thine own graves filled with thine decaying bodies and smallpox. Ye shall know hunger and pain, and the winter winds shall mar your bones and ye very souls, and those who shall protect ye shall be stricken down." 4 men rushed up behind her and dragged her out of the crowded courtroom, as she was still lying upon the residents of Salem, a curse of death and despair. From the trees 9 thick ropes of twine did swing freely and empty. The nooses at the ends of each rope waited to be satisfied, with the promise of a broken neck filling each of them. Horses were aligned under each large tree, consisting of elms and oaks. 9 trees down the street, the horses did stand. On each horse a condemned witch, males and females, sat, waiting to fill the hungry nooses. The ropes were slid over each neck of the 9 members, Elizabeth and her accused coven. They did not wear sacks. Their faces were left exposed for the watchers to delight in amusement as each lost soul was condemned to hell. Standing in the crowd, still and without shared excitement, one man witnessed the events that day in Salem. His reddish-gray hair was tousled and thin. He waited and watched as the horses were eventually moved away and the 9 bodies, each in turn, swung to and fro, their feet kicking out, looking for surface. The 9, each in turn, had faces of red with eyes that bulged from their sockets. Purple tongues dangled from a few of the damned souls as death claimed them. Elizabeth kicked about in turn. The father of one of the townspeople pushed forward his 3 small children and encouraged them to swing from the dangling body of the witch that hung and fought against the marriage of death. Each of the 3 children did cling tight to the dress of the condemned, and it tore loose, revealing her nude pelvis beneath it. The children grabbed her legs, swinging with Elizabeth, 2 on the left leg and the 3rd clinging to the right, pulled upon the swaying body until it was still and free of its cadaveric spasms. The rest of the children would have the same practice upon the remaining hanging witches until there would be found within each of them a stillness without a twitch. The man with the reddish-gray hair disappeared unnoticed into the thick shadows of the forest. Just as midnight approached with all of its promise of damnation and retribution, the man who stood silent as the 9 bodies fell lifeless stood before an old wooden slab of wood. His complexion was rough and weathered. Orange and red flames danced in the fireplace behind him. Black soot painted the gray bricks surrounding the fire. Upon the slab, a burlap-wrapped object lay still. The man with the reddish-gray hair held himself in a deep trance-like state. Deep in his stare was an urgency to fulfill a task. When he removed the covering, the body of Elizabeth Good lay before him. Her neck was twisted, and the flesh was misshapen. Her bulging, opaque eyes stared blankly through the ceiling toward the heavens above the dilapidated log cabin that was tucked away deep in the secret shadows of the Salem forest. The middle-aged man removed a jagged dagger from a worn brown leather wrap that was on the table. The blade plunged deep into Elizabeth's chest. A small amount of blood pooled about the blade, where it peaked just above the dead flesh of the cursed and dead witch. It made its way from the laceration and slowly trickled down a simple crimson path that collected upon her abdomen. The blade was pulled downward with both of the man's fist-gripped tight hands, creating a great gash of length of her sternum. With a strength greater than any human, the bleeding incision was forced apart, one hand holding each side. Clutching tight in its grip, Elizabeth's unbeating heart was torn loose from its home. Blood dripped from the bottoms of his hands as the quiet heart was held with the most deliberate caution. The fire raged brighter when the heart of the corpse was placed in the flames and consumed with a blistering hiss and a silent crackle as it scorched and withered in the fire. In the far corner, barely noticeable in the log cabin where firelight did not dance, a row of burlap-covered bodies, in the same fashion as Elizabeth, lay stacked close to each other. 8 bodies fresh from the gallows offer the noxious aroma of the decay from the rotting flesh, with each corpse being a product of the snapping of the hangman's noose. The man stared, still intently, into the fire. He waited many moments before slowly reaching into the flickering flames. Bare-handed, he reached into the red embers that offered a simple glow. The fire licked his arms, but did not scorch or blister his flesh. Sparks danced and whirled about him in the darkness. After a moment, he found his item and withdrew it from where Elizabeth's heart had perished within the hungry fire. In his hand, the man held a scorched, round object as black as the soot-covered bricks. Smoke rose from it, black and thick. It danced in circles into the air, disappearing into the darkness above. His other hand covered it and squeezed. A brittle glass-like coating shattered apart, and beneath it, it was a bright and shiny object made of gold. It was a heart. It was plunged deep into Elizabeth's chest, where her mortal heart had once been. It beat once before the grisly gash instantly closed and healed, revealing only briefly a bright shimmer of gold from the fire's reflection, and it shone brightly from inside the dead woman's chest. When the woman's dead body was completely healed, it showed no signs of stress. There was no scar, no golden light, no broken neck. She was in pristine condition. The corpse of the dead Elizabeth twitched and moaned softly. The man who had watched their bodies succumb to mortal death smiled as he watched the reanimation into something much more powerful and dangerous than any human could imagine. Her movements became more deliberate. From the dark corner of the log cabin, the 8 corpses wrapped in worn and dirt-laden burlap also moaned and moved about. The man stepped back, cloaking his large frame in the darkness of the shadows, and waited in secret silence as Elizabeth and the 8 other witches that had been hung started to reawaken. After a few moments, as the newly reborn coven of witches stretched and found footing in the shock of returning to a world that had banished them for falsities born of the condemner's greed, the man who had snagged the 9 members of the coven from the world of death and reintroduced them as something superior to what they had been, stepped forward again, into the light of the raging fire. He now appeared as a small boy with sandy blonde hair and the small frame of a 6-year-old child. Elizabeth and the coven would learn to call him Dylan. At 1 o'clock that morning, the pitch-black night sky gripped tightly to the bright silver crescent moon, squeezing it so hard that its light poured upon the log cabin and the dense woods and illuminated the area the cabin sat, where 9 naked men and women danced. They danced to rejoice in their rebirths and to the horrors that they would soon inflict upon those deserving of the great wrath and those foolish enough to protect them.